now let's look at a different type of chart. So far, we've looked at the bar charts, which are good for comparing magnitudes across groups. This figure is different, right? So that means that this chart is answering a different question. It's a pie chart, which is designed to show proportions of a whole. How is a whole divided? That's the question that it answers. Pie charts answer one very specific question, which is how is 100% distributed across categories? And I'm just trying to see, okay, there are two different pie charts that we see, and we see the percentages. One for people with a post-secondary certificate on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, we have the people with a bachelor's degree from a top-rated school. This is also from another credible source. This is from US Census Bureau. And each slice represents the share of the wage gap associated with field of study, occupation, hours and weeks, and unexplained factors. So we can say across both education levels, both the post-secondary and the bachelor's degree, large proportion of the wage gap is associated with occupation and industry, right? That's what we can say. Let's look at another substantial portion is labeled as unexplained. That is 31%, pretty much 31% in both groups. And the contribution of hours and weeks worked is much larger for certificate holders than for the graduates of top-rated bachelor's programs. That's another observation that we can make. And field of study explains a relatively small share for certificate holders, but a larger share for bachelor's degree holders. So let's ask our questions, right? Who collected this data? So these are our observations, and then we are now applying our critical thinking skills. Who collected the data? You see the source that is from a US Census Bureau, which is a very credible source. And what is exactly being measured? That's another question we should ask. This chart shows a statistical decomposition of the wage gap, right? So what is missing or what is unclear? That's another question, but right now we just see that there is a gap, a gender wage gap by education in those years, 2005 and 2019. So the other question that we should ask, what is missing or unclear, right? So to me, unless I read the article or the report, it is unclear to me how categories are defined, or whether these variables actually interact, and whether measurement error exists or these factors operate similarly across groups, right? So we don't necessarily know. And what comparison is implied, if we were to ask that question, is that the implied comparison is between the different explanations for the same gap, not between men and women directly, right? So it's the gap explained by different factors. So we're no longer asking whether a gap exists in this one. We're asking how it might be structured. Another question that we can ask if we want to practice our critical thinking when we're reading a chart, in this case a pie chart, is that what conclusions can we draw? So this chart suggests that the gender wage gap is associated with multiple factors, including occupation, work hours, and a very big, substantial, unexplained portion, and that the relative importance of these factors differs somewhat by education level. So, though the chart doesn't establish the causality, that's very important to understand. And this pie chart is useful to show us what the different factors actually contribute to the gender wage gap, if we consider that as a whole. The pie charts are useful for this kind of showing proportions, right? But they have limits. First of all, they're hard to compare slices across the two pies. Like as you can see, there are two different slices, and small differences are visually hard to judge. Imagine that if we didn't have those numbers, let's look at the second part of the second pie, and you see two slices, right? 31.7 is like the light blue gray color, the unexplained one, and then the purple one is the occupation and industry, is like 32.4. If we didn't have those numbers, it would be so hard to see which one is actually bigger. Yes, the purple pie looks a little larger, but we don't necessarily know. That's kind of the limitation of the pie chart. And no uncertainty and confidence intervals are shown, right? So the pie charts are not for that. They're not about communicating the uncertainty. They are about showing the proportions. So if we're talking about critical thinking, of course we need to talk about possible misconceptions and how kind of to unbias those, right? Let's look at the possible misconceptions, what these percentages are and what these percentages are not. One common misconception that I see all the time when people read pie charts is that these percentages show causes. What people may think, if someone looks at this chart and they may think 38% of the wage gap, right, is caused by occupation. Actually, what the percentages actually are shares of the observed wage gap statistically associated with variable in a model. Another misconception is that field of study is only 4%. Look how small that chart pie is, right? So it's irrelevant. If it's 4%, so it's irrelevant. But what's actually true is that small percentages can still represent large dollar amounts, or their effects may interact with other variables. So size of a slice is not necessarily the importance of a factor. So it's important to be aware of that. And the chart shows 100% of what the model explains, but not 100% of the reality, because there could be other reasons that just because we didn't include in the model, maybe the percentages would have shown differently. But just because we didn't include in the model, we don't actually necessarily see the picture, right? So the big picture. So the only conclusion we can make from this chart is that we can say that the wage gap is associated with multiple factors, as we saw, but the exact measurements and the modeling details, right, are not visible here, which of course limits our causal interpretation. Another very important misconception that I want to emphasize, that especially important for pie charts, is that the slices are independent. What people think, occupation, hours, the field, like all these colors are separate choices, or they're independent from each other. But in reality, these factors are actually interrelated, most likely very much related to each other. And the model assigns portions for communicating the clarity, not necessarily independence. Like the model doesn't say, or these factors, the model doesn't say that these are independent factors. So the clear phrasing for this kind of a pie chart would be the slices are analytical categories. Okay, they're not independent from each other. And how this chart can be misleading, even if it's accurate. Okay, so these are common ways that people get misled by looking at the pie charts because they don't have the necessary practical critical thinking skills. One is illusion of precision. So just because it tells all these percentages, like 30.1, 31.3, like exact percentages, it doesn't imply certainty. It doesn't have confidence intervals, or there's no uncertainty here. So just because it sounds very precise, don't think that it is actually it implies the certainty. Another very strong temptation that people have is the causal storytelling. So readers, like, this is human mind. Human mind wants to see a story. They want to see a pattern. They want to see a story. They want to fill the gaps in between. So readers want a clean explanation, and pie charts visually suggest that this much is happening due to X. but the format invites causal stories that data cannot fully support, at least just by through the data. Okay, so through the chart. So charts show patterns. Causal claims require a careful, rigorous designs, research design. So just by looking at this, we can't claim a causal argument, okay? To say X causes Y, you need actually 3 conditions. It needs to have like a temporal order. X happens before Y. When you see a Y, you always see an X, right? That's a temporal order. Another one is covariation. In order for us to make a causal claim, we need covariation. When X changes, then Y changes, right? And elimination of alternative explanations, which is very important. No other factors explain this change. We should be able to say, as far as we know, they're not alternative explanations, right? So the main ways to establish causality is actually randomized experiments. That is the gold standard in research. And how it works is that it randomly assigns people to treatments or the control condition, and only difference between these groups, assuming that the groups are, or the people who are assigned are random, because they're randomly assigned, you assume that they're actually identical groups. The only differences between groups is X condition, like an X intervention, like for example, randomly assigning identical resumes with male and female names, and then seeing if there's a systematic difference. That would be a causal relationship. But just by looking at this pie chart, which shows association, we cannot make a causal claim. So that's very important. Okay, so another example, this time also from US Census Bureau, from this article called Women's Earning. Let's look at another one. Okay, so this is an interesting one. Let's look at this chart, okay? This is not just one chart, it's actually composite, like a hybrid chart made of 2 coordinated visualizations. On the left-hand side, we see a horizontal bar chart, which shows percentage of women in each occupation, and 1 bar per occupation, right? And the purpose is the composition to show the representation. And on the right-hand side, we see a grouped dot plot, sometimes called a pair dot plot, that shows the median earnings for women in the purple dot and men in the green dot. That's how they choose to represent. And 1 pair of dots per occupation. And the purpose is to compare the values, right? To compare values for men and women. So before we actually dive into and critique the chart, we should be actually clear about what it does show, right? So what is clearly shown in this chart is that the percentage of women in different occupations and the median earnings of women and men within the same occupation, within the same row, right? Within the same bar. What's also important to know, what this chart doesn't tell us, it doesn't show why anything, right? Why pay differences, why this is happening. It doesn't show us anything about causality, right? Or it doesn't show us whether men and women hold the same roles within the occupations, differences in seniority or number of hours worked, or leadership positions, the promotions, so on and so forth, right? It doesn't show us. Potential misreading for this kind of a chart would be if we don't apply the critical thinking skills and just immediately jump into the conclusion, would be that this proves discrimination in every occupation. Look how different than the men and women. For each occupation, there is a clear discrimination. One may easily tend to say that. Yes, gaps appear repeatedly, and pattern looks systematic, but it doesn't, again, show us discrimination is systemic, and it doesn't show in just one metric. So in this one, the only thing that we can say is for each gap, there is a difference between male earning and then female earning. Another potential misreading is women choose lower paying jobs, so the gap makes sense. So this is also very tempting because many female dominated occupations are lower paid, but it is incorrect because the chart shows within occupation gaps too, and occupational choice doesn't fully explain pay differences. Okay, what would be concluding in the policy making, in law, in academia, when you're interpreting results, it is important not to overclaim. So we can say that this chart shows that women are highly represented in many lower paying occupations, and gender pay gaps persist even within occupations. That's what we can say. While the pattern is consistent with structural inequality, the chart does not explain the mechanisms, it doesn't give us the causality. That's very important.